This is Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy. I'm its executive chairman, and I'm very pleased to be the host of this video featuring Felipe Tudela. He is a man who is, I believe, an up-and-coming star in Peru, where his father has been a prominent public servant for many years, including its first vice president and foreign minister. We've been speaking with him on a number of programs, and discovered, to our delight, that his son has been giving a lot of thought to the nature of the challenge that his own country is facing, but frankly, many other countries around the world are as well, i.e., the challenge posed by totalitarian ideologies, most prominently communism, and the techniques that are used by the communists and some of their allies, including, I think it's fair to say, Islamists, or as I'm fond of calling them, Sharia supremacists, who have their own end state in mind but are perfectly prepared to work with other totalitarians like the communists to achieve certain shared ends, a lot of which seem to have to do with taking down, or at least removing as an obstacle, the United States of America. Felipe, it's very good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your very thoughtful analysis of the sorts of challenges we're facing. Sort of lay out for us how you see it overall.
First of all, nowadays communism has morphed. It has a new face. It's not the same face we saw during the Cold War. They now have this new modality called the 21st century socialism. And what it does is it infiltrates the legal institutions of a country. It didn't naturalize those institutions until they are nothing but a shell of what they used to be, so that in the outer world, it looks like those countries have a democratic government. So you see a democratic elected president, you see they have a Supreme Court, a judicial system, separation of power, Congress. But if you analyze...
But in fact, there's no separation of power.
Exactly. They do legal reforms so that the president, the executive, has total power over the rest of powers of the state. So he chooses which judges to put in charge. He even has control over Congress. He uses legal reforms, usually with polls, to reform the constitution so he can be re-elected. And usually, this is what is happening in a lot of countries in Latin America, in Argentina, and other countries. But how they get to power is really interesting, because they use democracy against it itself. They no longer are interested in taking power through armed force, but they use what they called an armed pacifist seizure of power. No, it's the classic newspeak of the left. So once they are elected democratically, they do all these legal reforms and use the army to maintain the power. So they don't have to use the arms against the people or the government.
This is actually not a new phenomenon, really. The totalitarians have been using it at least since Adolf Hitler's time, where he came to power in a sort of split electoral situation and hollowed out the entire government of the Weimar Republic and essentially seized and turned it into the Third Reich. So to the extent that this is sort of a playbook that we've been seeing, particularly the left practice, to what extent are you witnessing it playing out at the moment in your own country of Peru?
I have seen it since President Vizcarra coup d'etat. And I have also seen it in other countries, in Chile, in Colombia. And I also have seen experiments done in the United States, especially with Occupy Wall Street and the BLM marches. where I believe they were experiments to see how the American society will react. And the modus operandi was the same, the reaction was different. And I believe the main difference is that American society is not yet demoralized. In Latin America, societies are very fragile and have a lot of conflict. So it's easy to take power because they don't take much action and don't recognize really the values behind the liberal order.
Demoralization is obviously one of the goals of the sort of revolutionary techniques that you're talking about.
Yeah.
How is it accomplished? Give us an example of some of those
Well,
demoralizing techniques.
yeah, in Marxism, there's this philosopher, this Italian philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, and he proposes that the way one should address power is not through violence, but the appropriation of culture, or the hegemony of culture. So usually they...
Cultural march through the institutions, I think, was
Yeah.
a term he coined, was it not?
Yeah, and what is done is usually through schools and universities, the left appropriates the discourse, the cultural discourse, and then it's easy to manipulate them when it's time through social media or television by acting cues. Yeah.
So dividing a population makes it more fragile.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think a country that I'm particularly familiar with, and I think you were sort of alluding to, is our own, in
Yeah.
terms of how these Marxists inside the United States, whether it's Black Lives Matter organization or whether it's, I don't know, Antifa or some of the other groups associated with them, or the Democratic Party for that matter, and those who are now in the executive branch operating in places like the Pentagon, for example,
Yeah.
for heaven's sakes, where this so-called critical race theory
Yeah.
technique is being applied. Would that be an example of the kind of divide and conquer strategy, not class warfare, but race warfare
Yeah.
that the Maoists
Definitely.
brought us in the past?
Definitely. The objective is to impose the narrative that American society is innately unjust and oppressive. And
Systematically racist is a term.
in this
that
case,
is
yeah,
often
but
applied.
it can be also class warfare, sex conflict, whatever. And by doing that, they create popular discomfort. So people...
And divisions.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is the thing that I guess I'm most struck by, is the irony that I believe this really kicked into gear with Barack Obama,
Yeah.
who came to office with the avowed purpose of what he called it fundamentally transforming the United States of America, who, however, was elected, I think, with substantial support from whites, obviously from blacks, other people of color, but on the premise that we were going to make a huge and perhaps ultimate step away from a past history, long past now, but past history of racism, by electing a black individual and demonstrating that this was now a colorblind society, one really under the profound influence of Martin Luther King's, you know, the content of your character rather than the color of your skin, you know, call to our country. This was exactly the opposite of the effect that it was achieved by Barack Obama. I think he did more to divide our country, did more to incite or certainly stoke those residual racial tensions, or manufacture them all out of whole cloth, even before we were calling it or applying it as critical race theory. So what has happened in the intervening period, and as you say, with the Black Lives Matter, you know, sort of proof of concept, how does America respond when people torch courthouses and storefronts and cities, for that matter, when it's all couched in this idea that they are simply responding to oppression, racial
Exactly.
oppression and injustice and all of the cumulative grievances. So what would you say are our prospects in this country if we allow it to continue to be divided this way, especially in this manipulative way by Marxists and the like? Are we susceptible to, or would you suggest we already have seen something along the lines of what you've experienced in your country with the election of people who actually have this as their agenda?
Yeah, what you described is exactly what Marxists use. It's called the molecular revolution. That's a term coined by Felix Guattari. That's a French philosopher that took a big role in the marches of '68 in France. And what they do is do manifestations that are with no clear reason.
Strikes.
Yes, strikes that don't have a particular objective. It's very dispersed. It's very unclear. But that's exactly their force, because if you can't point your finger at what they are really marching against, the marches never end because you can't talk or dialogue with them. So, and that's a modus operandi that has been used in Latin America successfully, and in the States somehow successfully. And usually this comes accompanied by pressure, social pressure, with big corporations through social media that support those marches.
This is a very important warning to our country, and a very timely one, I think. A lot of us are beginning to awaken to what seems to be not simply isolated incidents of sort of inexplicable conflicts and challenges at a societal level, but realizing that there is something of a connective tissue to them all, that there's a sort of ideological objective or purpose behind
like
it,
a manual.
the molecular level or otherwise. Yeah, the playbook
Exactly.
of the radical left. If you had a word of counsel to Americans about both how to understand what we're up against and what to do about it, what are the techniques that should be brought to bear to try to counter the techniques that are causing us this great difficulty?
Maybe first of all, get educated on the subject and learn how they operate, because they feed off the naive people, of the naivety of people, and speak about it, be it in social media platforms, YouTube or Twitter.
If they'll let you do that,
yeah,
which is the challenge, because
exactly.
increasingly we're finding censorship when any of these sorts of topics are discussed by people who are not in favor of the left and its agenda.
Yeah.
Which is really, again, I think of another of the playbook items. It is suppression
Censorship
of information. It is denying people the kind of situational awareness that might prompt them to respond. Do you see the opportunity for a course correction in your own country, in our country, in some of these other nations where this technique has been very successfully applied, Latin America especially?
Yes, there is. Ironically, there has been a growing organic community of conservatives and the right in general through social media, mainly YouTube. And this has helped a lot to the cause and to fight hypocrisy or lies from the left. There are lots of leaders that have formed in Latin America and in the United States. And I think maybe they should start to cooperate with each other, because this is not just a regional issue, it's a global issue.
Amen. Well, that's the point at which we're going to leave this particular topic and our conversation with Felipe Tudela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for joining us as well, and hope that you will both take aboard and resonate to this call for collaboration with other freedom-loving people in our hemisphere and, for that matter, beyond, in preserving what we treasure in terms of the societies that nurture and protect freedom, and fight those, in the nonviolent sense of that word, of course, who are seeking to take freedom away from us. This is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for listening.